I'm so glad to be joined by Matt Stoller today on Bad Faith Pod. You know him as the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. He is the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, and of course, author of the excellent Substack to which I am subscribed. Big welcome back to the podcast, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we were talking a little bit ago, I think last week on The Hill, about Elon Musk and the Twitter buy. And while a lot of the critique, the blowback that has come his way on Twitter, at least, has been from liberals who are concerned about kind of the character of the man and whether or not he is truly invested in these free speech ideals that he purports to be invested in. You had a different kind of critique that I think is really interesting and I want to get into. But first, I wanted to ask you about this latest news that came out over the weekend about what Elon Musk actually purports to do at Twitter. It was in the New York Times.
Yeah, I saw it. I mean, so I think people don't really understand that Twitter is just a terribly managed company, putting aside its importance or censorship or any of the other issues. I had a friend there he was there sort of from the beginning, and he used to tell me the management of Twitter is stoned all the time.
Literally?
Like literally stoned all the time. And I mean, this was years ago, right? But it's a messed up company. They spend $1 billion on R&D. What are they doing? You don't really see a lot of new products coming out of there. They have talented engineers, but it's just a messed up company. So I don't think it'll be that hard for him to, fire a bunch of people and just generate some cash flow. That's not, I mean, it's terribly managed. You bring someone in who's just doesn't, I guess he only gets stoned some of the time. And that's like an improvement, right?
Yeah. I had no idea that there were those kind of personnel issues, but what do you think of this? He says he's going to quintuple Twitter's revenue to $26.4 billion by 2028, while cutting Twitter's reliance on advertising to less than 50% of revenue, from around 90% is where it is in 2020. And he plans to do this through a couple of means, including by growing Twitter as a subscription service through subscription services that already exist, like Twitter Blue. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit, that they can pick up. I mean, it has, 300 million users that are, has a lot of brand loyalty. I imagine there's a bunch of things that are pretty obvious that he could do to, improve cash flow and get more users or whatever. So I don't think it's particularly difficult to see how he could make Twitter successful. I will say this, Elon Musk is kind of a bullshit artist, right? He makes promises all the time that he just sort of doesn't keep. And, you can say that, oh, he's lying, or you could say, well, he's kind of, encouraging his employees to reach for the moon. And, like he promised, oh, Tesla will have, self-driving capacity by 2017 or whatever. He promised this in 2013. I'm just making that up. But he does those kinds of promises that just don't come true all the time. But then, what he would say is, well, I use it as a motivational factor. And so we don't have self-driving cars when I said we would, but we still have awesome electric vehicles, which which no one else has. And so I think, you got to look at these Twitter projections and say, it's just a song and dance man doing his thing, right?
Well, as an anti-monopolist, I wonder if you, assuming that there's anything that comes of this, if it makes you optimistic to hear there's going to be a shift from funding from advertising to funding from a subscription model, the idea being that it is the advertising incentives that are driving some of the worst content moderation decisions on at least some of the other platforms.
Yeah. You just don't know if it's going to come true, right? So I don't take anything he says seriously, right? It's not particularly credible. But I think that generally speaking, my observation about social media in general, and I would apply this to Twitter, is that Twitter is structuring speech, right? But the traditional norms that we use, like the traditional legal frameworks, like defamation or certain forms of fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, all of, a bunch of torts, right? That you used to be able to bring, and you can still bring them against individual users, but you can't bring them against the platform themselves because of section, because the law prohibits you from doing that, even though Twitter amplifies tremendously through its algorithm certain forms of speech and discourages other forms of speech. Facebook, TikTok, they all do that, right? And what that does is it's like it's like pollution, right? You don't have to pay. The platform doesn't have to pay for the speech that they amplify, even if it's illegal speech. And
Right.
so I think that we should get rid of that protection. And then, if there's defamation, and it's on Twitter, if Twitter amplifies it, then it's Twitter's problem, right? And right now it's not. So that's
Right.
kind of like where I come down. I think there's a legal policy problem here that we can address.
So you're referencing Section 230, I presume. And
Yeah.
the Section 230 wars have been going on for quite some time.
Right.
I had Zephyr Teachout and Glenn Greenwald mooting this about a year ago. And some of the concerns I think that Teachout in particular expressed was that, if Section 230 prevents these platforms from being liable for the content that's published on the platform, if you entirely repeal Section 230, there's a concern from some folks that smaller platforms or platforms that are just entering the market, if they are responsible for every comment that is made in the comment section, content over which they're not really exercising any curatorial power, then that makes it a very high barrier to entry for anybody new coming in the market. Whereas the Facebooks and the Twitters and all that, who can have millions and billions of dollars to hire content curators, are able to basically increase their monopoly power. Do you have any of those concerns?
I don't. I think that there's a, look, the Section 230 helps institutions that are big. That's what it does, right? So if you're running a community forum, or you've set up a forum with a sort of a set of communities, and you have community leaders moderating those platforms, that will take care of the problem. You cannot do content moderation at scale, and deal with, you can't do content moderation at scale. It's just not possible. And so what will happen is these platforms will find a way to devolve power to users. They will have to, right? And the reason that we have these laws in the first place is because defamation is really bad for society, or when you allow it. And what happens is people, tend to duel, right? That we used to have a big problem with duels in the 18th century and before. And we dealt with that by creating legal forms that would allow people to preserve their reputation. And when you get rid of these legal prohibitions, which effectively we've done, you can see that it's tearing our society apart. We're not that far away from these kinds of violence and things like that. And you can see this with like a whole series of bad behavior. It's just kind of like we used to have laws that dealt with that, and now those laws are basically unenforceable. So that's the way I look at it. And I think there is an argument, and a lot of people say this, oh, Facebook has so many lawyers, they'll be able to like deal with this, and like smaller platforms won't. And it's like, well, that's just an argument against any sort of law at all, right? Because there we go.
I can hear some people say, well, if the consequences are so high for these platforms, in fact, if they're too high and if they're responsible for too much, then what they're going to do is have broad sweeping bans on speech triggered by certain words that may or may not actually rise to the level of defamation or any kind of inappropriate speech, banned speech, hate speech, incitements to violence, and those kinds of things. And that what you're going to have is, in fact, less freedom instead of the more freedom that Elon Musk is promising. That doesn't strike you as a possibility.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that having, a few giant worldwide speech platforms is the only way to structure free speech. And I don't think it's a very good way to structure free expression. I think we should have a lot more, like we used to have thousands of local newspapers. Now we 15,000, 20,000. Now we have whatever, 6,000, 7,000, but they're tremendously hollowed out. A lot of them are ghost papers. And those, that is a real loss, right? And you don't replace them with one giant paper. I mean, you can, like the New York Times is super powerful and Washington Post is super powerful. Mm-hmm. And that's not good, right? To have those, they used to have to compete with a whole bunch of newspapers all over the country. The Cleveland Plains Dealer, they had international bureaus, right? And so they could break stories and did break stories. Now it's just like you have two newspapers. And that's I mean, there's more, a few more than that, but in terms of just like newspapers that affect the national dialogue, you just have two. That's really bad. And I look at these platforms the same way, which is they are too big and too powerful. And the right way to deal with it is to have a lot more platforms that are, or what, we used to call them websites. Like, just,
But this is the thing. Like, is there a difference between those things?
Yeah.
Because this is what trips me up sometimes. It's like I understand, and we've talked about this before. The power, the utility of something like a Facebook or Twitter is in part in its market power. The fact that there is one Facebook where all of my childhood classmates are, and I don't have to bounce around to different apps trying to find everybody. There is one Twitter where I know that all the journalists are, for better or for worse, talking to each other and generating news cycles. And there does seem to me not to be like not a direct correlation or a direct mapping onto some of the technologies of old, where there isn't an expectation that I pick up any newspaper and I'm going to get every story. I'm intentionally seeking out discrete markets for just different kinds of coverage, whether it's financial coverage versus broader coverage, whether it's Cleveland's local coverage versus national coverage. And I don't feel like some of these platforms are intended or benefit in the same way. They still may benefit, but they don't benefit in quite the same way for there being a multiplicity of the same thing. They do seem more like less like outlets like the New York Times and more like a website like Google.
They're sort of a mix. You're talking. Wait, so you're saying? I'm sorry. I'm not totally following you.
So it feels more like it should be. Maybe this will help. So this is from an article that Zephyr Teachout wrote, I think last year in the Atlantic. So she supports repealing parts of 230. She says, in part, I think any company should be held liable for the content it promotes, paid or unpaid. Repeal alone, however, doesn't address the centralized control of speech by a handful of tech companies. Facebook and a few others will still decide to classify Occupy Wall Street as a terrorist organization, for example, or decide that double masking criticism or promotion is a conspiracy theory, or decide to devalue certain political debates and search results, et cetera, et cetera. Repeal doesn't change the incentives to promote high conflict material. It doesn't address mass civic surveillance. She goes on to say, in most American law, infrastructure is subject to different rules. Infrastructure, treating it as infrastructure, that's the word I'm looking for, is subject to different rules than other consumer goods. It is treated as a public utility and regulated in the public interests. Companies that maintain infrastructure are not allowed to charge different prices for different people who want to access it. Communications infrastructure is banned from spying on those who use it. The Postal Service can't open mail and it can't charge one marketer $5 and another $10 to send the same poundage of bulk mail. Telephone companies can charge different rates for different kinds of calls, but they can't charge different people different rates or listen in on calls and use what they learn from marketing. So the idea that, Facebook is more akin to a telephone company,
right,
and should have kind of similar kinds of restrictions, unless Zephyr argues it does behave in a curatorial capacity the way the New York Times and these other outlets that actually moderate the traffic and control what you see through the algorithms and whatnot. At that point, you would become liable.
I think that's fine. I mean, if you are if you like, these are the problem is these companies fit. They're neither fish nor fowl, right? They sort of have telecom type of aspects to them, but they're financed through advertising, right? So they're financed the way that publishers are financed. And we all know that advertising creates corrupt incentives for newspapers. You don't want to piss off the advertiser, but we deal with that through a whole bunch of different mechanisms, including a diversity of newspapers, right? So yeah, sure, all of them are corrupt, but they're all corrupt in different ways. So you can kind of get the truth out. If you can't get your story out through one of them, you can get your story out through another. I mean, that's, there's always going to be conflicts of interest. I mean, welcome to humanity, right? But the idea is diversity, and you distribute power, and then you can create some sense of truth, right? But if you don't have a consolidation, what happens when you finance telecommunications networks with advertising is that all of a sudden you introduce the same conflicts of interest that you see with media, except you introduce them into a communications environment. And unlike with newspapers, which have had these kind of ethical debates about the nature of advertising and its effect on editorial independence, and you have had unions involved in that. You've had a whole series. You have hundreds of years going back. You have nothing like that with communications. It's just, what does Mark Zuckerberg think? Like, he's going to come up with some random view to like deal with the conflict of interest where the communication network has an incentive to care about what you say. Like T-Mobile, AT&T doesn't care what you say. They just want to charge you money for using their, dumb pipe, right? And well, that's what Zephyr is saying. She's saying, like, look, if you're a telecom network, then you have charge money, and you're a public utility. And if you're selling advertising, then you have to take responsibility for the content. And I'm fine with that basic view. I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So then that's,
and look, one way that you could do it, you could do it is Facebook, right? They have a news feed, right? And one thing they could do is they could say, we'll take care of the connections between all of your friends. That's Facebook. And so we'll be that like backbone. But the news feed, that's no longer us. We are going to introduce a market for newsfeed, and you can choose whatever newsfeed you want. And the newsfeed providers can charge you, or they can sell advertising, or whatever it is. That's up to them. And then all of a sudden they become the backbone provider. Maybe they charge the news feeds for rent, or maybe they charge you, or whatever it is. But
maybe it's what it used to be, which is just a randomly generated stream of whatever the people that you followed post.
Right. They could do basic reverse chronological order, right? If you wanted to do it that way. But the idea there is that they're no longer legally liable for, like, the news feed then becomes legally liable. So if the New York Times has a certain way of doing a news feed where they can pull stuff from your friends but intersperse it with New York Times content, then, New York Times is now liable for that under Section 230. I could see this like with a number of different you do not need to give up the idea of social media. What you need to give up is the idea that no one is responsible for the amplification and the speech that is happening on social media, right?
I think that's the key point.
Right.
Moving from properly identifying the difference between what a publisher is and what a platform is, and forcing the folks who are in between into one category or another.
Yeah, I think that's
so. If you want the protections of a platform, great. You don't just get to hide behind Section 230. Yeah. You have to behave like a platform and genuinely be neutral and stop making curatorial decisions, algorithmic decisions that are feeding a lot of the, misinformation, for lack of a better word, or other kind of bad faith content.
That's 100% right. I mean, the reason these guys, their margins are so great is because they don't have to take responsibility for anything that is going on their platform, right? And so they have no costs. It's like they monetize, they're basically taking the content from newspapers and from their users, which doesn't cost them anything. And then they're selling advertising against that. And it's like, if you do take stolen content, if I sell like stolen TVs, there's great margins on that, right? I mean, that's what's happening here. So,
right.
and Section 230 allows them to do that. There are market power questions as well. So I think you should break these firms up so that you have more platforms. And I think that there's a lot of cool things that we can do to make this stuff better. But fundamentally, if you look at like your podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a much healthier way to actually have to actually organize discourse in a society, the podcasting market, right? And there are reasons that the podcasting market works, and there are reasons that this is the way that newspapers used to work, which is that the distribution, the advertising, and the monetization and the production are all separated, right? Like, mm-hmm. You make the podcast, but you don't own the app that people use to listen to it. You don't, the monetization layer is not yours. And there are lots of people that are doing production, and there are lots of people that are trying to do monetization, and there are a bunch of people that are trying to do distribution. Now, Spotify is, of course, trying to roll it all up, right? There are attempts to monopolize it, but that hasn't happened yet. But fundamentally, healthy healthy markets in general, if you usually have that separation between production and distribution and retail. I mean, you could see that in liquor markets. You could see it in information markets, like movie markets, right? Now that everything is streaming and it's all Disney or all Netflix or all, whatever the others, Peacock, it's like, Amazon, it's like kind of screwed up versus when you used to have, a theater and then you'd have different producers, and you'd have distributors, or you'd have, TV networks, and you'd have independent producers and advertisers. And it was all, there was competition in there. And so you could sort of tell what was going on. And now it's just kind of like, well, some dude at Netflix thinks this will be a good show, buys it, and then there's a bunch of people that watch it, but maybe they wouldn't pay for it. Like, we don't know anything that's going on. So the quality of this stuff is getting worse. And that's what you see, I think, that's what you see with social networking. It's what you see in a lot of areas, but it's not what you see in podcasting, right? Like Obama, one of my favorite things is like Spotify didn't want to renew Obama's podcasting deal because he's just not working at it. Like, and when you know this, I mean, you work really hard to produce a good podcast, and your audience listens to it because they identify with you. And if you half-assed it, they would stop listening to you. Right?
There's so many articles. There's so much reading. There's so much research.
You put yourself in it. People can see that. And so when you throw Obama in there and he doesn't really care, Obama and Bruce Springsteen and Renegades, right? We should just do the rest of the podcast making fun of that. But
also the problem with that podcast, because I really listened to it. I listened to that one. I listened to Hillary Clinton's podcast. I was really trying to get a sense of what was happening to everyone who's jumping in this podcast market. Pete Buttigieg had one for a second in 2020. I don't know what happened to that. But they are hamstrung by the fact that they can't say anything real about themselves eiting.
His podcast is now called the Department of Transportation. Really
also going nowhere.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I'm open to the idea that Obama and Bruce Springsteen having a completely unprepared for off the record conversation could be sincerely interesting. But of course, who Obama is precludes him from bringing any of the intimacy to bear that is required to have those kind of casual, off the record, unprepared, spontaneous podcasts that exist and do work. Not everything has to be like a nerd fest, research academic podcast, but you can't be neither of those things. It can't just be a canned politician who've been hearing for the last decade saying the same, anodyne statements over and over again, just happen, in the room with another guy who we like. And it's frankly a lot more charismatic than Barack Obama on the podcast. But all of that is very much beside the point. I mean,
usually I'm the mean one about Obama. I like this.
Well, welcome to BreadTube, LOL. No. But I will just say that one thing about I understand the point about breaking up.
No. Let's get back to the podcast. Let's get back to hating on Obama for a second. The point here is that Obama has Obama has every advantage over you, right? Obama has every advantage over most people, over Joe Rogan, over anyone who is trying to do a podcast. If you were to bet, can Obama do a better podcast than pick like the top 20, podcasters? You would say absolutely the guy can do it. He's famous. Everybody knows him. He's huge popularity. He has a ton of interesting things to say. And yet it failed. And the reason it failed vis-a-vis all these other people is because it's not as good. And the point is when you have, and the only way we know that is because there are open competitive markets, right? If Spotify had to determine who gets to go on podcasts or who gets to release a podcast, who gets to monetize their podcast, then Obama would, work really well. Not work really well, but Obama would be what people listen to because Obama would be what there is versus having an open market where you have all these other people. And the thing is what I'm trying to say with these social networks and what I'm trying to say with Google and YouTube is that what is happening is effectively they have they are not allowing for these kind of open systems to surface the best content and allow that relationship between the audience and the creator.
Well, you wrote recently on your blog about Adam from Adam Ruins Everything, testifying about how the only time that he was really censored on his show, or an episode of his show was taken down. It's like a comedy, infotainment kind of comedy show, was when he was talking about the negative effects of monopoly power as his company was being eaten up and merged, and it had direct effects on his show, which ultimately got canceled. Can you unpack that for the audience who might not be aware?
So Adam Ruins Everything was a good show. It was on True TV, and True TV is owned by Time Warner. And then AT&T came in and said, we want to buy Time Warner. And so what they did is, first of all, they bought True TV, or they bought Time Warner, and laid everyone off and shut down the show, even though the show was successful. And that was his main point. But a secondary point was as the merger was happening, he had an episode of Adam's Ruins Everything called Adam Ruins the Internet, which was on cable monopolies, and AT&T, surprise, surprise, is a cable monopoly. And so Time Warner was worried that this would disrupt the merger. So what they did is they took that episode, they took it off of reruns, and they took it off of the streaming service. And so people couldn't find it because they just didn't want to piss off AT&T while this merger was going on. And then AT&T closed. And, I guess then they eventually, a couple of years later, they put it back on HBO Max. But that was like a good example of just straight up corporate censorship that happens all the time. Corporations just censor on their own behalf, right? So we can talk about, censorship, are they hurting the left or the right? It's like they're helping themselves, right? So if you say mean things about the corporation itself, they will censor you. I mean, I'll give you two other examples. So one is Sheryl Sandberg. This was a couple of weeks ago. The Wall Street Journal reported that there was a story that made her look bad, right? So apparently her boyfriend, who was the CEO of Activision, had a bunch of restraining orders against him by an old girlfriend. And, that's Sheryl Sandberg's boyfriend. So, lean in, makes her look bad, icon of feminism. So Daily Mail was going to report on this. And then the rumors are, who knows, he said, she said, but, this Activision CEO said, Facebook will no longer do business with you, Daily Mail, if you publish this. So Daily Mail said, okay, fine. And they didn't publish it. And it's like, Facebook, don't get into a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel. Like, don't get into a fight with the person who makes all the ink, right? I mean, is the ink monopolist. Like that's what we're talking about here. And that's just straight up censorship. And the other example is that in 2009, back when Mark Zuckerberg was nice and cuddly, there was Facebook was a very different company, and they were competing with MySpace. And so they were trying to portray themselves as this safe company versus all those weirdos on MySpace. And they said, we are going to never surveil anyone. And then they rolled out something called a new terms of service that allowed for more surveillance. And Facebook users who felt very, they felt a lot of ownership over this pretty small company. They organized hundreds of thousands of them in a group called Facebook Users Against the New Terms of Service. And they were able to actually beat back Zuckerberg and force them to take back this terms of service. Zuckerberg then just deleted the group, destroyed all the archives and said, you know what? As a new policy, no groups can form with Facebook in the name or Zuckerberg in the name. And so that's censorship, right? That's straight up censorship on behalf of Facebook so they could move into a surveillance business model, which they then did. This is routine, and it happens across the board. It happens in Hollywood. It happens, in big media. It happens in big tech. This is just what happens. And so when we're talking about, and this was my worry with Elon Musk is Elon Musk, one thing we know about Elon Musk is, I kind of admire him because he sort of does some interesting, useful things, but he's also a con man and a fraud, which, so are all the rich people. But he's kind of this wonderful example of the perfect con man fraud engineer. So he can do cool things with the fraud, right? Which is the only cool, that's the only way you could do cool things in 2022 is if you're kind of you're able to cheat people out of billions of dollars, which you then use to occasionally make something cool, which is what he does.
And why he's so difficult to criticize, right? Part of why I wanted to talk to you today is because, the polarization of these political factions on the internet is such that I've noticed us doing, co-hosting Rising over the last 2 weeks. If I say something that is not a strong position in either camp, if I say something like, I'm skeptical that Elon Musk is going to make Twitter better.
Right.
The implication is that I'm saying that because, I hate Elon Musk and I think he's a right-wing tyrant and I buy into whatever narrative was in the New York Times about how he was an apartheid South African racist and all this stuff. And it can't just be because he's another billionaire. I have skepticism about his motives and the extent to which he is going to use his power to benefit the people of Twitter, as opposed to your point, his own financial interests and his relationship to China, which we should get into. But because he does have, I don't care if you think Tesla is cool. That's great. I don't care if you think it's beneficial that he's advancing electric car technology. Cool beans. But you cannot, people have to think. That doesn't give you thinking a Tesla is cool. It does not absolve you of a responsibility to consider the implications of it on on actual speech, not just the idea that he's going to punish the people you don't like. And it's very frustrating existing in this space where, I don't know, it does feel, this is one of the first times I do feel a little like, I mean, my brand has always been nuanced, but this feels like it's an impenetrable faction landscape right now when it comes specifically to the issue of Elon Musk.
Yeah. I have this overwhelming urge to be sarcastically condescending, but I won't. No, I was just going to be,
my butthurtness about all of this.
Yeah, it's going to be okay. Don't worry. I want to boop you on the nose.
Right, Matt. Well, tell me.
No, I don't know. No, look, I mean, what I do, like I nerd out. So I wrote a piece about how, the big problem with Elon Musk is that he's owned by the Chinese Communist Party, right? Yeah. Because they basically gave him a free factory in Shanghai, which he's using as an export platform for Teslas. And this is really bad for a lot of reasons. It's really, really, really bad. And they made him the richest man in the world, which he's using to buy a very important speech platform for Western elites.
When you say that, by the way, I want to make sure, we were specific about this. When you say that they made him the richest man in the world, it's because I think you wrote that 25% of his wealth has come from Chinese sales. Like, what specifically do you mean by that?
Yeah. So he owns about 15 to 17% of Tesla, right? That's where his main wealth comes from. And he owns some of what's it called, the SpaceX too, but and that's U.S. government contracts. I mean, don't get me wrong, they've done impressive things too. So Tesla, right? They sell about a quarter of their sales are in China, but also the factory. So they also use China as an export platform. They have a Shanghai factory, and he got around, the Chinese government does not allow Western companies to come into China without a Chinese partner usually, but they did allow Elon Musk to do that. And, when Shanghai is in lockdown right now because of COVID, and the Chinese government, the Shanghai government made sure that the Tesla plant didn't close down. And now they're expanding the Tesla plant, and he got all sorts of loans and subsidies and, expedited reviews and all the rest of it. I mean, effectively, he is a partner with the Chinese government. The reason that they let him do that is because he's transferring a lot of important technology to the Chinese, and he's also helping them build up an electric car industry. And he's an incredibly useful symbol for the Chinese government. So he goes to Chinese conferences and says things like, "I love China," and China is the future. And that's a real validation for the CCP globally. He also attacks the US government a lot, which is something that the Chinese government really likes. So he toes the Chinese Communist Party line. And he is deeply, deeply, deeply invested financially in the Chinese, in the Chinese government, frankly. And they have transferred, they've given him entree and access to their market and their production facilities as well. So it's a very deep-seated relationship. A lot of our oligarchs have those kinds of relationships. Certainly not unique to him. I mean, Tim Cook at Apple is like totally, it's straight up like slave labor in China is like, that's what they do, right? And so Nike and all the rest of them, they do it too. But Elon Musk is sort of, I don't want to say he's unique, but he's just very invested in China, and it's something that we're not really talking about. And the reason we're not talking about it is the same reason that you're like, where's everyone, right? And it's that usually the right wing are the ones that are the China hawks, right? And it's the Democrats usually kind of ignore China, or they're sort of like, why are you so racist, right? Those are the two approaches. But in this case, on a culture war line, in this case, the Republicans like Elon Musk on Twitter. So the narrative, you've got this kind of like choose your narrative, right? Are you going to choose the China hawk narrative, or are you going to choose the, own the libs narrative, right? And surprisingly, they chose the own the libs narrative, right? And now no one else. And so the libs are sort of saying, oh, we don't like Elon Musk. He's, the South Africa, sort of narrative is out there. And then you see a couple of people mentioning the China thing, but that's there are, the left doesn't want to demonize the Chinese Communist Party for a variety of reasons. So it's like we're caught in this narrative trap. And that I sort of live in the shadows, right? Because I don't like the culture war. I just don't like it.
Let's move this, Matt, because my first instinct was to say, well, what is the line here, if any at all, between kind of genuinely negative effects from a less free country on a platform that has whatever your critiques of it are, a lot of utility for journalism, and that I found to have a really important democratizing effect as I started my career largely on Twitter. And, a broader kind of xenophobia that does exist. I mean, how do you negotiate that as you write these pieces and write these critiques of Elon Musk, especially since, to your point, there are so many companies that are taking advantage of slave labor, low wages in China. And to your point in your Substack piece, the U.S. government's policies in terms of sharing technology with China, giving up its ability to manufacture locally, have encouraged a lot of the security risks and the supply side crisis and the inflationary crisis and all of these things as well. Why do you put perhaps more focus on Elon Musk?
Well, I mean, I was writing about Twitter, right? So I mean that I put a lot of focus on Apple too, right? I mean, I didn't single out Elon Musk. I was just sort of like, the interesting thing about this Twitter purchase is that the real leverage problem here is the Chinese government. So I'm not like obsessed with Elon. I don't like writing about Elon Musk. I find him, not that interesting. And Twitter, I don't think is a particularly significant monopoly problem. So I don't usually write about it. But everybody
really, why not?
Well, because the big issue is advertising, and Twitter just doesn't make that much money. They don't have a good advertising platform. So
why do you think that Twitter has become so much of a focus? I mean, even outside of Elon Musk, it was Trump getting banned from Twitter. It was a lot of the censorship wars seem to be. I mean, obviously Facebook's a big player too, but a lot of the conversation is about what is and isn't allowed on Twitter. The Hunter Biden fiasco.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Trump's Twitter, like Trump had used Twitter very effectively. Twitter has a kind of mind share among political elites and kind of certain economic elites, which is why it gets outsized attention. But what I tend to think about is advertising markets as a whole, because we don't have a lot of local press coverage anymore, and you've effectively destroyed everyone who could publish and was ad funded, which is not everyone, but almost everybody, which is, this massive hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people. I don't know how many people who have been undermined by this, but now you have just a lot less expression going on because there's just not the money there to finance it that there used to be. And that, I think, is the more significant crisis. And Twitter is kind of like feasting on the bones of that corpse, but the corpse was killed by Facebook and Google, not Twitter. So that's why
do you think
I'm not saying Twitter's not important. I'm just saying I tend to focus on other things.
I'm just curious if Twitter is already one of the platforms. It's one of the platforms that's getting the most criticism, perhaps because every journalist in the world is on there.
I think Facebook. I mean, I think a lot of a lot of platforms get a lot of
one of getting the most criticism. I think Facebook is at the heart of the beast for sure. But if it's interesting to me to think that Twitter is right up there, and that it is also one that runs the least on advertising revenue, but also is being targeted by Musk to diminish the advertising as a percentage of revenue even less, from 90% down to 50% is his goal by 2028.
Right.
What is the incentive there? I mean, if Twitter perhaps is already better than others because it is not so driven by the algorithm, these algorithms that are supposed to foster hate to keep people clicking it online and like get advertisers, then it does seem to be kind of interesting that is such a focus of the plan here, especially if the idea is it's a not very well run, not very profitable company, and he has to recoup the $40 billion that he just spent.
Yeah, I don't know what the real plan is. I mean, maybe he doesn't have one. Who knows? I will say that one thing I think is kind of funny is that he offered a certain amount of money, $44 billion. And since he offered that money, that NASDAQ has dropped by, 20% or some huge amount, or Facebook has dropped. Basically, if he had waited until now and made the offer, he would have had to offer $35 billion instead of $44 billion. So he's already, and there's talk right now about whether he's going to lower his offer just because the market decline has been so swift, which I think is kind of funny. But maybe he just sees a way to make some money. I mean, look, you go into Twitter, you lay off a bunch of people, and you can boost cash flow really quickly. Maybe maybe that's the game.
Mm.
I don't know. I mean,
well, I want to go back to this China issue because, what is the concern here? There is talk already of TikTok being owned by China and but not as much, I think, specific conversation is about what the implications of that are as we've seen them thus far. And obviously, it could be, TBD what the long-term plan is here, but people express a lot of concern about what it means that America's most popular app is owned by another country, one with,
I think
too many
Trump
people
was
hostile
right. I
interests.
think Trump was right to ban TikTok. I mean, look, the problem that we have with China is you mentioned xenophobia. The problem we have isn't xenophobia. The problem we have is that Wall Street for the last 40 years and the Chinese government have been in alliance against both the American people and the Chinese people. And and they use, slave labor in Xinjiang to produce, iPhones for us and for people all over the world. We constantly transfer technology over there to help them build missiles that they then point at our cities. They are engaged in, a whole range of really bad activities. Effectively, the Chinese government, unfortunately, they are the Nazi party of the 21st century, and they are insanely dangerous. And
Matt,
we have to.
That is,
I mean, that's
a big statement that a lot of people are going to be mad at me if I don't ask you to interrogate.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, they're the Nazis in the early 30s. They started by putting together some concentration camps, and people thought they were a bunch of thugs, and they were like, "This is bad. This is really bad." But what we know of the Nazis, the reason the Nazis are the epitome of evil is because of the Holocaust, right, and World War II, and what they did later. And the Chinese government is, put a lot of people based on their ethnic background into concentration camps and use them for slave labor based on, based on ethnicity. They have designs to reorient the global system of power and undermine democracy everywhere. I mean, they're not trying to, maybe they don't care if we have elections, but they certainly have a whole sphere of stuff they don't ever want anyone anywhere to talk about. And they've made that clear. So we just kind of have a question here. I mean, look, I don't love having to do this because everybody thinks not everybody, but people seem to think I'm some sort of like rampant nationalist. But there are valuable things in America that have to do with the fact that we can express ourselves and that we are, liberal democracy used to work. Doesn't work now. It hasn't worked in my lifetime, certainly hasn't worked in your lifetime or your listeners' lifetimes. But it's better than what is happening in China. And the Chinese have designs on eroding and ending democracy worldwide. And that is just a fact. That is just a reality. And Wall Street has contributed to this by offshoring factories. And that, that's just a fact. And like, people don't want to deal with it on the progressive side because they have these messed up ideologies and they basically don't have faith in liberal democracy. But that's just the reality.
Messed up ideologies. I think that what many people on the left would argue, and I can't speak for them all, but I think that what many people would
speak for the entire left. I know you have no mixed feelings about the left at all.
What many people would argue is that the fact that you describe the entanglement of Western democracies with China and in the entanglement there, and the fact that it is our oligarchy, it is our corporatized democracy that is facilitating the sitting of the weapons and the sharing of the tech information, including weapons information, and the knowing entanglement of our distribution chains with China means that whatever it is that there's left over here, whatever residual idea of democracy that is left, is also long gone because America itself, our government itself, is not looking out for the interests of the so-called democracy that we're so invested in protecting. And I think that people have an ambivalent feeling about digging their heels in to protect something that they think is already gone or so significantly compromised that it's only a matter of time. Yeah. And the resistance isn't to critiquing China, but at a kind of slippage, and I'm not saying that you're doing this, a kind of slippage that absolves the U.S. of its role in all of this, and which pretends there is more freedom. I'm not drawing direct contrast. Obviously, there's meaningful, important, and significant differences, but that pretends there is more freedom than some people feel like we've already lost in this country.
Yeah, look, I mean, I totally get that, and that's the way I feel. The problem. So there's the Patriots critique, right, which is the more perfect union, right? Is America, the idea of America, the idea of liberal democracy itself. You never achieve it, but in striving for it, you can achieve some measure of freedom and liberty and egalitarianism. And that's, sometimes you can do better, sometimes you can do worse. But the idea of a patriot's critique is one of optimism and a sense that we can fix things, we can improve them, we can be a free people, right? And I believe that. It doesn't mean that you are saying everything we do is great. It doesn't mean that you say that everything, that like, it's an unalloyed story of progress, except for a few hiccups here and there. It means that America is a battle, right? It's a battle, and we have the honor of being able to participate in that battle without weapons. We don't have to, it's not violent. We have the ability to use our voice. We have, we have this fantastic technology. We have this incredible culture. We have, so much that we have the obligation to use it to promote freedom for everyone, and not freedom for everyone, through military means or anything, but freedom for all of us. And I say all of us, I mean all of us in America, but because that's my country, but also the next generation, right? We will hand down what we have to the next generation, and I believe we have a responsibility there, and that's the Patriots critique. I think the anti-Patriots critique is America is the Jeremiah of America. America is a sinful place that is full of lies and fraud, and it's no different than any other tyranny. And in that sense, that's China's line. China thinks that, the Chinese government thinks that, and has convinced the Chinese people to think that. And a lot of people on the left think that. And, I don't. And I think the reality is that if you ask people, and I don't think people on the left, I don't think anyone on the left really thinks that. I think they would say.
I don't think very many people think that at all.
No, but the thing is that there are plenty of people who say, well, there isn't any, why is China's totally right about this? And, we're an oligarchy. Oh, America's always been, this.
China's right about what specifically?
What?
Wait, what do you mean people who say China's right about this? China's right about what?
I think China, well, pick the latest, China likes to say that, America, liberal democracy is a sham, that America is a racist tyranny, that that the idea that America is owned by the wealthy, all of these things.
I'm not hating any of that so far, man.
Exactly. That's the point. Is that the
where's the lie? What's the problem?
The problem is that America is a battle, right? And the idea is that America is what is America is a contested question. And if you say America is a racist tyranny, right, then there is effectively no difference between a fascist state and the American order, right?
Well, I don't think that one thing.
Well, you can't have it both ways. You have to pick one, right?
No, I don't think that's true at all. They're obviously different extremes, different degrees of racism and fascism and oppression. All of that is true. And that is also true when we're talking about America today versus America 50 years ago versus America 100 years ago. There are gradations of difference between all of these things. And I would hate to be doing the thing that the right does, conservatives do, where they basically say, if you don't bend the knee and accept that America is the greatest place on earth and has always been the greatest place relative to its peers always, you're un-American and not to be credited or respected. Because what that game does is prevent you from identifying the problems that exist today and having a constructive conversation about it. So I think what the left is usually doing is to say, I don't understand why you need some concession that America is better than China in this respect and that respect, to also be able to have an honest conversation about the ways in which America is still failing.
I'm not saying I'm not.
No, but even it is our country.
Even in the premise of your statement, America is still failing, presumes that success. You're setting a bar of success, right?
Yes,
and I agree with that.
We are currently.
I agree with that. I think
more perfect.
Right, more perfect. Right. So the idea is America's not living up to its promise, right? Which I think is the critique that I have. Right. I do believe that America is not living up to its promise and has not lived up to its promise. Really, in like we can get into more complex, like there's more complex ways of laying this out, but like America's never lived up to its promise for Black people. That's never been
Correct.
But things have gotten better, and they got a lot better, right? And
great. And what is that do for an argument that anybody's making?
Let me make a broader point. Well, first of all, so let me make a broader point. there
America's
is
gotten better, and so
no. So
what follows that?
the lifespan. You look at lifespans. Like lifespans have been falling since 2016 for white people, and now recently they've also started falling for Black people, and that is like catastrophic, right? Like that is horrific. It is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. There have been times when like lifespans have fallen, like briefly, during the avian, the flu pandemic of 1919, but like this is crazy and something that is unusual in America right now. This does not happen or has not happened in American history. Something is going very, very wrong, right? And the point of a patriot's critique is to say, why is this going wrong? There are ways that we have oriented our nation for everybody that have delivered more freedom, that have delivered more prosperity, egalitarianism, a sense of liberty, a sense of our ability to cultivate ourselves and our communities. And that something broke. Something broke. Something isn't living up to that right now. What is it? Let's figure it out. Let's fix it, right? Instead, and I think this, you go back, there's like a historical narrative that, America is just this place of sin. And, there are variants of this. And you can like a lot of like a sort of progressive historiography is this essentially, and therefore we can kind of expect. Richard Hofstadter said, he says there's never really been any ideological debates in America. Americans have always been capitalist, and it's always been kind of a mess. And we've had like some status anxiety, and those have always characterized the fights in America, and those fights have always been based only on ethnicity, right? And he was concerned about like fights between WASPs and like non-WASP white immigrants, but like that was sort of one angle, and that's the Hillary Clinton narrative, right? Things are already great, and the only question is kind of how do you diversify elites versus and that's like a declinist view of America versus the way that I see it, which is, and the way that I think populists have seen it, the way that like, you can look, and people change their minds over time, so the same person can see it differently at different periods in time, but the idea of the more perfect union and improving, that the idea of being an American is that you have political and economic rights, and you have the ability to develop yourself and your community. And that is like, if you don't have that there is something wrong, and we need to fix that through our politics. And I just see a lot of defeatism, a lot of declinism, a lot of sense that, there's no point. It's all rigged. It's all corrupt. It's always been corrupt. And that is like, that's not true. It's just not true. And things are very bad right now, but it's just not true.
Man, there's just so much here. America has not always been corrupt. America has not always been rigged.
Yeah.
At what point was America not rigged or corrupt? Was it the bit where in the beginning only landowning white men who even had the right to vote? Is the bit where we structured our government so that the Senate had an outdo power that was not a direct democracy and gave emptier states that were more pro-slavery more power in our government? Was it the bit where we gave, we called it checks and balances, but gave an unelected lifetime term crew of people the right to overturn legislation from democratically elected government, even though there was a really legitimate question as to whether or not it actually was constitutional? Like what part of the system from the beginning was so perfect that it's not a fair criticism, even if you think there's a lot of really great benefits?
I never said it was perfect. I said it's never been perfect. It never can be perfect.
But what part of that from its founding? Like, I understand that people have this issue with the term original sin. I'm not religious. I don't care for it in a Christian Catholic context or whatever. And I don't care for it, I don't think it's especially useful in a political context, because I think it makes people feel as though, and some people do mean it this way, but mostly they don't. It makes critics feel as though, critics of the original sin language feel as though there is no ability to improve. And that's a kind of Afro-pessimism that I personally don't subscribe to. But
let me turn it around on
you. Acknowledging that America had some significant flaws at its founding.
No. That's not what you're saying. That's no. You're going back and forth. You're saying, tell me when it wasn't rigged. Tell me when it wasn't corrupt.
You said it hasn't been rigged and corrupt from the beginning. Those were your words. And so I'm asking you for the point in American history where it was not in fact rigged and corrupt.
Let me ask you this. If it's always been rigged and it's always been corrupt, then why does it matter why do we care about, the Chinese system or the American system? Who cares?
Well, because it can still be better than certain alternatives. Like, I'm not making this case necessarily, but even the people who defend the rigged, corrupt democracy that we have say that they live that glib little line that like democracy is the worst system in the world except for every other system. Whomever it was that said that,
That was
like
Winston Churchill, I think.
Winston Churchill. Good for him.
He
Like
was kind of a monster, actually, but like, I mean, defeating the Nazis like kind of wipes a lot of like. Basically, you get to do a lifetime of monstrous stuff if you defeat the Nazis. That's like the one exception I'll put there.
Like, but you see my point that just, and this is, and I'm not saying, I'm not trying to conflate you with what conservatives say, but this is the magic of this kind of argument when it's used by conservatives. They say, aha, you say that America has always had problems. So you must not be a patriot who's invested in the idea of America or the betterment of this society. You're basically a treasonous traitor. Screw you. You just want me to do CRT and self-immolate because I'm white. No, I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying it can be true that nothing's perfect. Nobody's perfect. This should not be a bizarre concept to anybody.
How are we disagreeing? I mean, the premise here is a more perfect union, that America's never lived up to its promise. It never can live up to its promise, but it's still worth trying to do that. Like that's the premise here.
So Matt, we started this back and forth because you said you objected to the idea that people think that America has always been rigged and always been imperfect. If you agree with me that it has always been rigged, however you want to define that, I would define it in terms of the way we set up our government.
It's always been rigged. Like, what is in 1776, America was the freest, most highest wage place in the world. Like, it just was. It was if you were a white man,
it wasn't for my people.
No, it wasn't, and it also wasn't for wasn't for Native Americans. And there are a lot of there are a lot of interesting, weird dynamics that go on there. But the idea that human beings, right, should be free and should have certain rights and sort of Enlightenment kind of ideas, that came out of the American Revolution, right? Or it was operationalized in the American Revolution. It just was. No, it
wasn't. We had the Haitian Revolution. We had the French Revolution.
They came after the American Revolution. You think that they're like people in Europe.
You're telling me my investment in the idea of freedom should come after the American Revolution, which was in part motivated by basically. Let's say it should come out of the American Revolution that kept
I know where you were going with that. I know where you're going with that.
What?
No, sorry, go ahead.
The idea that there were incentives for enslaved people to fight with the British in the American Revolution because there was a greater promise of freedom. The people were trying to break free from, ostensibly by many arguments, were more free. And, these are arguments depending on what position you're coming from. That's what I was going to say. But regardless, you're telling me that my investment, then this is a relativistic view of history, but this is part of what, I'm sorry, CRT and everyone has been trying to explain to folks, is that your view of history is highly contingent on what role you and your ancestors and you would have played if you were there today. And from my perspective, the idea that my conception of freedom should be inspired by the American Revolution and not the Haitian Revolution, when the American Revolution did not a whit of good for mine.
I didn't say we shouldn't be inspired by the Haitian Revolution. I'm
just saying this idea of freedom that everybody's
no.
And that they
hang on a second.
An American ideology.
No. That's not what I'm saying. Look, there have been. Look, okay. Most of the ideas that inspired the American Revolution came out of they came from. Actually, a bunch of them came from Native Americans. They came from Scotland. They came from Hebrew scholarship. They there was sort of very, puritanical Christian ideas. None of them came from America per se. They were ideas that were floating around. They were cross-Atlantic ideas. And then they manifested in the colonies in a certain way for certain people that harmed other people, right? Like Native Americans split. Some of them took the side of the British and some of them took the side of the Americans. That was true for Black people too, although I think few more took the side of the British than Americans. And it worked out for some groups and it didn't work out for other groups. And there were a lot of, by the way, fights between 1776 and 1787 that involved a whole series of economic battles between veterans. I mean, there was Shays Rebellion. There was a lot of stuff that was going on that involved like the formation of Wall Street. There was a lot of really interesting things that shaped that revolution. But what happened in 1776, and then what the country that we became, and then the country that we have changed over the centuries. There is a lot of laudable stuff there. There's a lot of terrible stuff there. And just as, Frederick Douglass drew inspiration from Thomas Jefferson and was horrified by Thomas Jefferson, we can both take lessons and horror shows out of what those people did, right? And I think you should.
I don't deny that. What ends up happening is,
you said you were like, should we be inspired by the American Revolution? I think we should be inspired by the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution.
That wasn't my question, Matt. That wasn't my question. This is a bigger conversation about whether or not it is accurate to say that America was corrupt from the beginning. And a rejoinder to that for you was to say that there were these ideals that were present from the beginning, which we should value, which I do not contest. But you put forward the idea that this idea of freedom is paramount and important, and we should all really celebrate it. And I then countered that my conception of freedom, I would prefer to base that ideal in a revolution other than one that maintained another 100 plus years of legalized slavery and another 100 years of de jure apartheid state for the people I happen to have descended from. That's all that I was saying.
Oh, you. Of course, right? No, I get it. Like, I'm first of all, I'm really enjoying this. I really like it.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's the thing about human beings is each of us has a devil and an angel that lives inside of us, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something amazing about, I wish I were religious. I'm not particularly religious, but there is there's something amazing about acknowledging that each of us has the capacity to do great good and great evil. And it is that I think we should celebrate. And I think that we should, we should recognize that we have freedom. Freedom is not the ability to just go smoke weed, right? Freedom and liberty is hard. It requires discipline. It requires responsibility. It is, and I think that we, a lot of the sort of libertarian ideas about freedom, they confuse libertine vices and just being able to do whatever you want with liberty, or they confuse liberty for capital with liberty from capital, mm-hmm. right? And I feel very strongly, I'm an anti-monopolist, right? And my view is, the American conception, though you battle in America, one of the core battles, not the only one, but one of the core battles was freedom for capital versus freedom from capital. And both of those have freedom in the word. Both of them are. And so it's confusing because a lot of people are saying, well, why are you impinging on my freedom to, treat workers like shit, right? And there is an impingement of freedom when somebody treats workers like shit. And you are impinging on their freedom to do that when you say wage and hour rules or the rest of, or antitrust rules or anything else. And yet that is not the kind of freedom that I think we should value in America. It is freedom fundamentally for the slaveholder versus freedom from slavery, right? And mm-hmm. I think we have to make that distinction. And that distinction is about power. And so when the great American tradition is paralleled by the great American sort of evil, right? Which is the pro monopolist, the pro brutality vision of society, and both of those have coexisted from the beginning. And what to me is inspiring about our history, and can be inspiring, and is also horrible, right? Like, because you can see these moments right after the Civil War, right, where there was this moment when we had the opportunity to build a society that was free for more people. And then there was this austerity-driven collapse. And after that, it was just sort of like, boom, we went into not slavery exactly, but like reverting pretty badly and built basically a fascist terrorist state in the South. And that was just, you could see that didn't have to happen. And that is like mm-hmm. such a horrible tragedy. But there have been other moments when we've done the opposite, going into the Civil War or the New Deal or other, choices that we've made choices to invent great technologies that are just like not, there's all of these amazing, inventing the movie, like that form, like there's all of these amazing things that we've done. And and all these horrible things that we've done. And I think that we should just look at that and say, this is really incredible. Look at what we can do. Look at what we can do when we actually are free, and we have a free from capital, as opposed to the society that we are in now, which is freedom for capital. So when I look at China and I see what they do, and I see their alliance with Wall Street, that to me is the biggest threat to democracy, and like that idea that we can be free, that we can allow others to be free as well, because I think that is sort of the union between people that explicitly do not believe in freedom for the little guy, and the people that are sort of passive aggressively agree with that, which is Wall Street. And the reason I sort of take issue with a lot of like the non-patriots critique versus the patriots critique, both are critiques, remember, is that it is, if you say, look, it's always been a tyranny, it's always been rigged, it's always been corrupt, which I acknowledge you're not saying, and I acknowledge there's nuance.
I am saying that. I am saying that. I just don't think that that's mutually exclusive with saying that all of the good things that you articulated are true also.
That's what I mean.
We've succeeded in tyranny.
Right.
We have had gains in tyranny and corruption.
So you're basically saying the more perfect union argument. You're saying, yes, there's always been like corruption,
the reality of the status quo.
We've been able to overcome it at some points, and we've lost to it at other points. As I think we would. So the idea that we've never been able to overcome it, right? The idea that it's always been, terrible. And I think you could see, that nothing has ever improved, that it's all a ruse, right? And I'm not going to pick anyone who's said that, but I think that you could make the case that there are people who believe that. That makes it easier for that Wall Street CCP axis to win, because then we just choose, because what's the point of trying to achieve freedom and democracy if it's all a ruse anyway, right? That's the basic point.
I hear what you're saying. I really do. I really, really do. And the reason I think this is so interesting is because the same way that you think that there are vulnerabilities to pretending like we can't do better, because then why even try to do better? I think that there are real vulnerabilities in overemphasizing improvement, because for some people, and I'm not saying for you, but for some people, it's an excuse not to do better. In the same way that you think that not acknowledging progress is an excuse not to try at all.
American exceptionalism is American exceptionalism. Sorry. I don't know why I got, sorry about that. I don't know how to turn my phone off on my computer. I don't know how to do that. So I'm sorry about that. Anyway, you were, let me.
No, you were saying something about American exceptionalism.
So American exceptionalism is bad, right? Just sort of saying there's something innate to human beings in America that makes them better than people or other places in the world. I think that's wrong. I think that's nonsense. But I think there's also, there are two. Oh my God. Okay. But there are two variants of American exceptionalism, and one is America's the awesomest country in the world, and the other is America's terrible and is responsible for all the world's sins. And those are both variants of American exceptionalism. And I think you have one of them is on, you could see them on both sides of the aisle, but neither one allows for human agency. And I believe in human agency. I believe that people have a devil and an angel. We have many abilities. We have, each of us can be cruel. Each of us can be kind. Each of us can cooperate. Each of us can be, can do ugly things. And I think it is contingent upon our choices as people and as a society, what we choose to do with our immense power. And that's all. That's what I believe. And I just don't want to see people lock themselves into the idea that we have no power, that we have no choices, whether it's the American exceptionalism variant, which I understand why you don't like it. And I don't like it either. I think, I come out of the progressive world. I'm not a fan. When I walk down the street and I see, people who have nothing, and I'm just like, it's the worst. It's just the worst, right? This is not a fair society. Okay. And it is, I hate so many things about this, this society right now. I hate so many things about this society. I hate that we can't make progress on really obvious things. I hate the cruelty that we inflict on people that don't have power. every day, all the time. I hate the fact that people make money from prisons. Like, there are so many evil things that we choose to do, right? Just because I have a patriots critique doesn't mean I think things are going well. Things are going horribly. Okay, that's just like, and they've never gone well in my, I've seen some things improve here or there, but the fact that does not mean that everything has to go this way. And it's just, we're so addicted to losing, and we're so addicted to.
I agree with that, but like 9 times out of 10, and I won't belabor this much longer, but 9 times out of 10, you got to be guarded about this conservative critique, this conservative line of attack.
It's not a conservative line of attack.
No. Let me just say what the attack is before you tell me that there's not a line of attack.
Then I misunderstood. Sorry. Okay.
This conservative line of attack that says, I literally just debated Charlie Kirk, and this is what happened.
Right.
Isn't it better now for a Black person than it was 60 years ago? Now, some leftist liberals will say no, because they can feel they're being drawn into a trap. And so they make it worse for themselves, and they'll say no, at which point Charlie Kirk can point to any number of metrics that shows that obviously life for everyone has improved, because that's the nature of modern medicine and the end of de jure segregation and all these things. But a lot of liberals will get caught in this argument where they say, well, schools are just as segregated as they were in the 60s. And then Charlie Kirk, the hypothetical conservatives will say, yes, but you are legally allowed to go to schools with white people, and isn't that better? And of course it is. Although, we can talk about whether enforcing separate but equal would have been a better outcome than integrating schools. That's a whole other conversation. The point is that I didn't fall into that trap. I'll readily concede that there are obviously many areas of improvement in the world between now and 1950. Obviously. I don't see the point in making that argument. But the reason that is still a trap for someone like me is because ultimately, if I say, yes, the world is better, conservatives say, well, then why are you complaining? Then why are you complaining? In the same way that when China came up, and I simply asked, is there any concern that some of the statements some of the critique of China, how do you discern what is xenophobia and what is a legitimate critique? I wasn't denying the reality of a legitimate critique, but also that there is, there are pros and cons. There are vulnerabilities in our own system that I don't ever want to ignore. There are ways in which our own, to your point, Wall Street is implicated in a lot of the horrors that we're describing in China. There are a lot of acts of intervention that America has taken over the course of its history that should get the same kind of critique that China gets, if not more so, because this is our country and we're responsible for it in the kind of republic / not really representative democracy that we live in. Okay, so all I'm saying is my only wariness is of people who use either of these critiques, whether it's the Patriots critique or whatever we're calling my critique, and saying, so what, and using that to basically justify the status quo. And so when I hear you say, okay, but America is better, and obviously we don't want to be China, yeah, I can concede to that, just like I'll concede to Charlie Kirk that racism is better than it was 50 years ago. But and so what? So we shouldn't be trying to make America better. So we shouldn't be trying to improve disparities and outcomes for various populations in the United States. So we shouldn't be trying to bolster our democracy, even as China is worse. That is my only. Let me my only hesitation.
Just to change this subject a little bit, because I want to get into like why I think one of the problems that progressives run into, or the left, or whoever we want to talk about. So, and this is, so I pay a lot of attention to China, right? I pay a lot of attention to trade, and so it in 2020, before COVID was a thing, right? I was, in January, I was like freaking out about it because I don't know if you remember this, but I was on Twitter being like, oh my God, this is like a thing, right? And it's kind of terrifying because I read this newsletter called Cynicism, which just covers in depth like China news about China. And he started writing about this respiratory disease that was kind of shutting down parts of China. And I'm like, China is poorer than we are, but they're not that poor. They're like a well-run or reasonably run country, like in terms of wealth. And if they're shutting down and this thing is contagious, there are flights around the world. I've read books around how flu works. Like this is going to come here, and we're going to have, it's going to be a shit show in the U.S. because our institutions are way weaker than people think they are. But who was freaking out about it? And I can tell you, and there's a Vanity Fair article about it. It was a bunch of right wingers, and like on the alt right, and then there were some randos in Silicon Valley who were kind of like around the Peter Thiel axis, and me, right? This weirdo progressive, right? Who like pays attention to China. And then as in late February, early March, kind of as people notice, oh, this is kind of thing, the concern among certain progressives was, we have to make sure that people are still eating in Chinese restaurants. Because
Okay, that was liberals. Come on.
liberals, whatever you want to say.
That was Joe Biden securing the primary and saying that Donald Trump
No, it wasn't. I'm not talking about the presidential. I'm talking about, I saw people in Congress doing this. I saw this was an activists were doing this. And there's two observations about this. Okay. And I gave a presentation to the Progressive Caucus in late February, and I said, we're going to have shortages. You guys should prepare for them. And they looked at me like I had like a third eye or something. They're like, what are you coming to us for, right? And then obviously we've had a bunch of shortages. I mean, it's a majorly screwed up economy. I think we have a really serious problem in the progressive world because we do not see reality. I just don't think that we are paying attention. We do not recognize that the Chinese government is powerful, that they have agency, that they use their power to achieve goals that, are not, are goals that you might agree with, in many cases they're fine, in many cases they're not. And we don't pay attention to them. And like the argument is always, oh, you say something about China and people are like, oh, well, you need to be careful about like Asian Americans or whatever. And it's just kind of like, we have to, like COVID. I mean, COVID, like what, and I'm not, this isn't you. I'm just saying, like the Chinese government covered up COVID, and, they might have created COVID in a lab, and like, then they lied about it. And this is a huge problem.
Okay, Matt,
it's a huge problem.
There's so many topics here.
No, but I mean, the point here is why did it take years for us to be able to have that conversation? There's something messed up about the way that we think about power. And I think that like when you approach institutions, like when you think about institutions and you're just like, you just kind of ignore them because you have this inevitabilist framework, which is what neoliberals have. They just think things just kind of happen, right? Like trade just kind of happens and we can just, do a few tweaks here in the tax code and things will be fine. And they don't manage anything. It's the same thing. I think that and it's not all progressive, and I'm not putting this on everyone, but it is very similar on the right and kind of the culture war types on the right and the left. They don't pay attention to the flow of stuff and how power actually works and how institutions work. Okay. And I think that's like my main critique.
I think that while of course there are vulnerabilities in every movement, in this particular example, if anybody is aware of the ways that a kind of flat understanding of identity politics can distract from underlying structural truths, it is the left. And it was the left that was rolling their eyes as Joe Biden tried to make COVID about Trump being racist, while then putting out his own like kind of racist COVID ad a little bit later in the cycle, and pretend like, the pushback I'm giving here is just that I totally understand that critique, and I don't think that
the left does not understand this. I'm sorry, but the left
is the one that's been leading the charge, apart from people who just are like the Charlie Kirk, the conservatives
leading the charge on what?
Who don't believe in identity because anti-identity politics, the weaponization of identity politics to advance.
Oh, well, maybe. I mean, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about China,
But that's what this is. I mean, what your description of saying like we can't be critical of China because it'll come off as racist is exactly the kind of like bait and switch and distraction from an underlying, some criticism of China as obviously can very much be racist, and some can be substantive because it is a country, the biggest country in the world, and there are going to be things to critique about it. And people have to be able to parse the difference. And so when I ask you these questions about China, I'm asking you about how to parse the difference, not the idea that any critique of China, of course, is racist, or is xenophobic, whatever, however you want to characterize it.
Look, I mean, I told you before, I think that the the Chinese government is the Nazi party of the 21st century.
Okay, well,
No,
let's
no, no, no,
have a
please
conversation
don't.
about that without using that particularized term.
I use that word because I use that word intentionally. Okay. If it's true, okay, like in the early 1930s, let's say it's not the Nazi party of the 1940s, right? But it's the Nazi party of the early 1930s. Like they're kind of getting ready for a bunch of stuff. If that's true, all right, and I think there's a pretty strong case that it's true, and it's within the bounds of reasonable that it's true, then we have a really big problem. And the fact that it's impossible for people to even acknowledge that that might be the case, I think we've got a really big problem. And that is not a problem on the right. That is a problem on the left. And I can tell you there is an organized campaign on the left to conflate the use of tariffs to deal with Chinese slave labor and the use of economic tools to protect jobs here with racism. That is happening. It is happening on the left.
Wait, so
okay,
you gotta unpack that. You gotta unpack that stuff. You can't just throw all this stuff out there, Matt, and not unpack it. So in your article about Elon Musk and China, you make an argument that, trying to lift sanctions, Joe Biden's now decision to try to, or the public pressure to lift sanctions to ease inflationary pressures is misguided.
Okay,
for two reasons.
Do you want me to give you the story of like a good example of this?
Well, do you want to just finish this? Is it the example that I'm describing that you wrote about?
Not quite, but anyway, go on. Just go.
Yeah, I mean, but I think this is relevant to the conversation. So you say that it's misguided for two reasons. Basically, one, that it won't work, that the supply chain issues are because China is largely still shut down because of COVID, and lifting tariffs isn't going to help us get the things that we need.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
There's a big traffic jam at our ports. You can't. Yeah. It won't matter, right?
They can't come out. It can't get in, and so it's a moot point. And then two, you're concerned about the kind of the humanitarian implications of lifting sanctions that were ostensibly driven by a desire to have better humanitarian outcomes in the country, right?
In China?
Yeah.
No, that's not why.
Is that what your argument? So
I'm not saying that we need better I'm saying we have to protect ourselves. Like, can I give you just a quick example of what's happening, like the insanity in our in democratic politics right now about
yes, please, because that's the other part of it, Matt. I think when the critique is like China's bad, no one's has a problem with it, but there's a lot of questions by U.S. leftists who are concerned about what America's role in it. Because I got to tell you, I don't vote in China.
Okay, so in China, right? China controls most of the solar panels in the world, right? They because they've subsidized their industry. The government said, we want to control the solar panel industry, so we're going to subsidize our industry, and then it's going to underprice everyone else in the world. And they did that. There's some solar panel makers in Germany, but they basically killed the entire solar panel industry in the U.S. We do have a bunch of solar panel installers.
Who's they?
Who they? The Chinese.
Yeah, who killed the solar panel industry in the U.S.?
The Chinese exporters. They were subsidized, and they so they underpriced all of our producers. Now, Chinese solar panels in China are made in Xinjiang, right? A lot of them are, or at least those certain components that are key. And it's not that we couldn't make it. It's just not economical because the Chinese government has a bunch of subsidies. Now, they're made in Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghurs are, and many of them are made with slave labor. They're also made with really, really, really dirty coal. So yeah, they're solar panels, but it's basically like crunching sand, right? And they sit them next to incredibly dirty coal plants and make solar panels with slave labor. That's how our solar panel installs happen. We don't have to make it that way. We could produce them here, but you have to actually make that happen with tariffs and with duties. Now, it's illegal to import products made with slave labor. We passed a law that says you can't do that. But the Biden administration is putting huge amounts of pressure on the parts of government that are supposed to enforce that to say, no, let them through anyway, because we need to hit our climate goals.
Yeah.
Right? Now, of course, and this is all the environmental groups, plus the private equity guys that are funding all of these solar panel installs, plus, and most importantly, like the Solar Industry Association or whatever it's called, which is, hired an ex-Obama official to run it and is controlled by the Chinese exporters. So it's controlled by the Chinese government. And there's a massive campaign to say, this is absolutely crazy to be enforcing a ban. They don't say it this way, to be enforcing a ban on solar panels made with dirty coal and slave labor. You're undermining our ability to address climate change, which is insane. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The other part is that there are actually duties on these solar panels that were put on in 2012 to address the subsidies. When you have a subsidy, there's a law here which says if foreign countries subsidizes the production of a product to underprice our products, we can put a duty on that, and we have. But what the Chinese have done is they are what's called transshipping, which is to say they'll like move the solar panel to Malaysia, and then it'll be a product of Malaysia, not a product of China, to get around those duties. Now that's illegal, and there's a circumvention investigation going on to say, well, all of these solar panels that used to come from China, they seem to be coming from Malaysia. Are they actually from China? And if they are, we're gonna put those duties on. Well, the Commerce Department said, we're gonna start investigating to see whether they're circumventing the law, right? Whether they're circumventing these duties. And it's supposed to be apolitical. These are not Trump tariffs or anything. This is just in statute. And the Biden administration and John Kerry and all the green groups are putting, and a lot of progressives are putting huge pressure on the Commerce Department to drop this, because they're saying, how dare you? You're killing our solar industry. And you can look in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and they have all these articles about how outrageous it is that Joe Biden is killing the solar industry. And nobody mentions the fact that it's all coal-fired power plants making solar panels made with Uyghur slave labor that is illegal to import, right? And that's what's going on right now. It's that Wall Street CCP axis that is really controlling our policy. And I think that is totally nuts. Like, that is how policymaking is happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really strong argument for some pretty pointed critiques of our American oligarchy, over which we have some control, unlike, regrettably, China, as the average progressive listening and voting. And I suspect, and maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I suspect that the majority of progressives that are listening to this show and who characterize themselves probably more as leftists than progressives don't have any issue with that critique, welcome it a great deal, and have a lot of critiques of the very climate groups that were the same ones that fell in line and endorsed Joe Biden and said that he was going to be the savior for climate, and that's why you had to vote for him against Donald Trump. Like, I think you might a little bit be underestimating the politics of this faction of the left over here.
That's totally great. I'm not I'm on your show, right? I like your audience. I like you. I think you guys are thoughtful. That's why I'm talking to you about this. No, I totally get. I think if the left or the right knew this, I think they'd be outraged. I really do. I'm just saying, like, our political infrastructure is sort of, it's not that, I mean, there's just so many bureaucracies. It's not rigged per se. It's just there's so many bureaucracies that are supposed to do something about this and are not. But there are also people who are trying to fight it. That's the other thing. It's like this is a fight right now. So it's like, it doesn't have to end badly, right? We don't have to. They have to spend a ton of money to try to like break this ability to stop these imports. We did ban imports made with slave labor. Like, that was a big fight, and Bernie, and Sherrod Brown were important parts of that and got it through. Weirdly, so did some right wingers. So it's like, we don't have to. This is a big fight, and it's happening right now. So, like, I guess that's kind of, I don't know. I think like anyway.
Matt, I appreciate you coming and helping us. Informing us in ways that help us to continue that fight. And I know we've gone long, but I've really enjoyed your willingness to engage and go back and forth.
So great.
Tell me, Matt, tell our audience where they can find you and more of your work, your Twitter @s and your Substack.
Yeah. So if you want to be interested and infuriated at the same time, so my Substack is mattstoller.substack.com. It's called Big. It's I'm much more buttoned down there than I am on this podcast. It's more just sort of straight monopoly chatter, and then I am on Twitter at Matthew Stoller. I don't recommend Twitter. You guys are all on Twitter. It's a bad thing. It's bad for me. It's bad for you.
Well, Matt, if you want to come and join me, I do a call-in show the day these episodes air. So this will be airing on Thursday. Okay. So if you want to join me probably around sometime between 6 and 8 p.m., I'll schedule it the day of to continue this conversation and to also take questions from the audience. I know they'd love to hear from you and ask you stuff directly, but no pressure at all.
Yeah. If I can
regardless of whether or not Matt is there, I will see all of you later this evening. Thank you so much for listening. As always, listeners, you can find an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast on Mondays by subscribing at patreon.com/Bad Faith Podcast for $5 a month. We really appreciate your support and our ability to do independent media separate and apart from all of these monopolies that are suppressing speech and innovation, and Adam ruins everything and the like. Thank you again, Matt, and to all of you, keep the faith.
All right.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/Bad Faith Podcast. That's patreon.com/Bad Faith Podcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.